I'm going to be talking about this topic of which is very current at the moment, especially in Britain and the United Kingdom. But of course, it was current with Dr. Glasser for many, many years before this, and his views on mental illness and his views on taking psychiatric drugs, which all of you will know about. They're there for quite a while. I'm just moving things around the screen here now so that I can see a little easier. Okay, so I'm just starting off there with a photo of Dr. Glasser when he was in Dublin at the European Conference in 2005. And there talking, shaking hands with them is Dr. Terry Lynch. And Dr. Terry Lynch was the person who wrote the introduction to Dr. Glasser's book, Warning Book. Warning: Psychiatry Can Be Hazardous to Your Mental Health. So Dr. Terry Lynch has been involved with issues related to psychiatric drugs in his writing and in his work as a psychotherapist. He is an interesting man because he began his work as a general practitioner, a doctor, medical doctor, which he is, and then he switched to becoming a psychotherapist. And he continues to write and present and deal with a lot of issues related to psychiatric drugs and withdrawing from psychiatric drugs, and has a number of books that he has written, which we'll be referring to. So he has been a long time involved in this area. He was mentioned by Peter Breggin in Peter Breggin's book in 2013. So, okay. On this, I refer into 1954, which was the year in which Dr. Glasser began training as a psychiatrist, began his internship. And I have a photo there of from Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverge in a wood. In that year, Dr. Glasser began his psychiatric training, and also the drug chlorpromazine, known as Largactil in the United Kingdom, standing for large action, came on the market, and that sort of transformed psychiatry. So you have biological psychiatrists going down one road, the drug-centered road, and you have Dr. Glasser going down a different road. So their paths diverged at that point in time. So we have the question here asking, why should we be interested in withdrawal? So I suppose we should be interested in withdrawal because it has emerged that this is not something that's easy to do. It's a difficult thing to do. So one of the studies in the UK in recent years has shown that 1 in 4 people in the UK in 2019 was prescribed a psychiatric medication. And 1 in 6 of them were specifically given an antidepressant. So it's suggested that that number might have increased since then because of COVID. And Professor John Reid, he's a clinical psychologist in East London, and he has been very involved in this movement. He says that women have a high, that's an average, those are average figures. And what he says is women get more drugs and poorer people get more drugs. So he says in the poor area of East London in which he lives, you could have up to 50% of women being prescribed an psychiatric drug of some sort. So it's a huge number. And the actual labels on some of the drugs, this is a label from Prozac. It says, don't worry about taking Prozac over a long period of time. Prozac is not addictive. So I suppose we're going to be having a look at that during the day. So there's been sort of discussion about is it addictive or is it dependence, or what is the correct term to use. I will be referring to these guidelines for psychological therapists, which were produced in the UK, and my talk is based around those 2019 with the 2020 update. And they go with the term dependence because it causes less problems. Now, Dr. David Healy, some of you may have heard of him. He's an Irish psychiatrist, but he's known on a world stage. And he has been involved as an expert witness in a lot of cases that came to court where involving drug companies. And he got access to different drug trials at different times, original data. And he talks about dependence, and he says you can have a lot of difficulty in coming off psychiatric drugs, and you can get hooked on them just the same as you can on benzodiazepines. And he says for most people, that's the meaning of addiction. So it's just a matter of what words. He says you're not going to probably sell your house to buy psychiatric medication or antidepressants in particular, but it's the difficulty is in getting off those. Yeah. Okay. Now, dependence. So what is meant by it? So the standard medical position is that antidepressants. I'm going to focus on antidepressants today because the guidelines focus on have sections on all the drugs, antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, the whole range, drugs for ADHD. But if you wish to, you can follow that up afterwards. I'll just sort of confine it to antidepressants, seeing that they are the most common drug that is prescribed. So the standard medical position is that antidepressants are not dependency forming. They don't cause, according to the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, in 2018, they said antidepressants don't cause the addictions that you get from tranquilizers, alcohol, or nicotine. In America, the NIMH, their biggest research organization in mental health, says people don't get addicted or hooked on these medications. And one doctor quoted in Terry Lynch's book in 2018 said, and she was a past chair of the Royal College of General Practitioners, she said, I can count on one hand the number who have gone on to have long-term problems withdrawing from antidepressants. So that was the position in 2018. And it's outlined very clearly in Dr. Terry Lynch's book, which he published in that year. Things have changed a little bit in the meantime. And those changes are what we're going to focus on today. One other term, addiction, dependence, the drug companies themselves brought in another term, they call it discontinuation syndrome, and promote to avoid admitting that antidepressants are dependency form or cause withdrawal. That term was introduced by the company Eli Lilly, the manufacturers of Prozac, and it's an interesting little story. Why did they held a conference on what they call discontinuation syndrome. Now, why would they do that? Well, they seen that they make drugs themselves, antidepressants themselves. And the reason they did it was that one of their competitors, GlaxoSmithKline, who produce the drug Seroxat, which is a short-acting drug, they thought would have more problems with withdrawal than their drug. And they thought that they might get some competitive advantage, that people might switch from Seroxat back to Prozac again. So they held a conference about withdrawal, and they came up with this new term, discontinuation syndrome, which most people in the field apparently don't like. They like to just call it either dependence or withdrawal or addiction. Okay. Now, that's a quote from Dr. Peter Breggin. He says, in my clinical experience, even if this patient had been seriously depressed and suicidal when the antidepressant was first initiated, he or she is likely to do much better with good therapy and a careful withdrawal from the drug. It's now abundantly clear that antidepressants in the long term make people more depressed and often disabled. By disabled, I think he means unable to go to work, unable to take part in normal social recreational activities, but particularly going to work. Okay. Now, how did this movement in the United Kingdom in particular begin to support withdrawal? How did that start? And for that, I'm going to show you this picture of a happy family. And the person in the center in this picture is a man called Luke Montague. Now, a little bit about this man. He had surgery, I think it was for a sinus problem, in his 20s. He ended up having some bad reaction to the surgery. I think it was to the anesthetic in particular. And he went to his GP, and his GP put him on an antidepressant. Over the years, he had to have, because antidepressants often cause people not to be able to sleep. They're activating drugs and they stop people sleeping at night. So naturally, it had to be upped and he had to have something additional to help him sleep. And because those drugs caused adverse reactions, he had to have 2 other drugs to deal with the adverse effects of the first 2. So he ended up on 4 drugs, and he said he was a very busy man. He works as a filmmaker, but he's also the son of an earl, and I think he will be a future earl. So he isn't just anybody. I think that's part of his house there behind the scenes. So he doesn't live up in a 2 up, 2 down, as they say in this part of the world. And I took that photo from an article he wrote in the English paper, The Times, about his experiences with antidepressants. So he went to his doctor because he was feeling that he was tired and he didn't have energy and he couldn't devote himself as well to his work as he would like to. So he said to his doctor, he said, well, you know, why am I on these drugs anyway? And I'd like to, is it possible for me to come off the drugs? So his doctor said, yes, it is possible for you to come off. Do you want to do it the slow way or the fast way? And because he was a busy man, he said, I'll do it the fast way. So he paid up a lot of money, went into a private clinic, and according to himself, he was taken off instantly, cold turkey, and had a very bad reaction to that and was unable to work for the next 4 years. Now, if this happened to anybody else, we probably wouldn't hear much about it. But he didn't just take this and not do anything about it. He had connections to Parliament, and that's where the story begins. So this is what we're talking about today, this guidance for psychological therapists. It's a publication which is free of charge. I'll send the links later on where you can actually download it yourself, have a look at it. It's about 112 pages in length. It has background about the drugs, about the medical model, effects of the drugs, withdrawing, and in particular then what role psychological therapists have in helping people to withdraw. So that little icon up at the top, pen Lancer, up here, that was an all-party parliamentary group on prescribed drug dependence. And he, through his political connections, through his father, was able to have one of those groups set up to look into prescribed drug dependence by all the parties in the Parliament, in the House of Commons in Britain. So that's a fairly powerful thing and not a choice or an option that's open to most people. So they in the end, it led to the production of the psychological guidelines for psychological therapists. And it led to it being supported by all the UK counselling organisations. So the UKCP, the ones that recognise the European Certificate in Psychotherapy, they recognised it, as did the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy. They're the 2 largest counselling groups in Britain. And the main the British Psychological Society gave their support to it as well. So it has support from a broad range of people. And there's an international organization here that's also set up that the International Institute for Prescribed Drug Withdrawal. They hold conferences. It's a fairly newly set up organization. Okay, so those are the editors of that publication. Now, what are the aims of the guidelines? Well, it mentions here that the aims of the guidelines are to enable therapists to talk and to clients and our prescribers, that means doctors, on issues around taking or withdrawing from psychiatric medication. That's the first. So that's a pretty big aim to have, to be able to talk to your clients about it. And because it's so common, and to 1 in 4 people being on a psychiatric drug, the chances are that most therapists are actually going to have, and you might ask yourself, have you clients that are either on psychiatric drugs or thinking of psychiatric drugs or thinking of withdrawing from psychiatric drugs? So the chances are that most people will come across clients who are in one of those 3 positions, and that this set of guidelines aims to help us all to talk to clients about it. And I know that clients do like to, because I remember when I worked in school, I often said to clients, and had you been to a doctor? And sometimes they'd say yes. And I got, he gave me, and I remember one pupil in particular just put his hand into a thing here, and he gave me these. He took out a pack of antidepressants, and I said, are you taking them? And he said, no. I'm not. So he wanted to discuss whether he would or he wouldn't, and he was holding off, waiting to see how I think the counselling was going to go first. So clients are willing and anxious to talk to therapists. The other aims of here to increase therapist knowledge then was the second, around the effects of the drugs, the adverse reactions to the drugs, withdrawal issues, and the impact of medication on the process of therapy. So that's the purpose of the guidelines. Now, I'm going to show you here just a 2-minute section of video on some of the key figures in the UK on drug withdrawal and who are behind these guidelines. The first person you will hear speaking there is Professor Joanna Moncrief. She's a professor in University College London, and she's also a practicing psychiatrist. And she has written a lot of the technical information on drugs, effects of drugs, and adverse effects of drugs, and whether they work or not. And the second person you will see is also a psychiatrist called Mark Horowitz, who is a training psychiatrist. And we will see he's interesting because he is actually withdrawing from drugs himself. He's a psychiatrist and he's also withdrawing from drugs himself. And he has written quite extensively about tapering and how to taper. And we will see more about that later. So, and I will mention then maybe who the other people in the background are. No. Oopsie daisy. This isn't just doing what I want to do, yeah.
I am a psychiatrist, and I've always been interested in psychiatric drugs and what they do to people, and trying to understand them from a different perspective and interrogate the way in which they are generally presented in the psychiatric field. So that's really what led me into withdrawal. Obviously, when you're trying to understand everything that a drug does, you become curious about what happens when someone's taking the drug for a long period and when they stop it, and what goes on after that. So that's my background. I'm now, after many years, a professor at University College London, as well as still practicing as a psychiatrist in the NHS in London.
Perfect, thank you so much, Joanna. Peter, would we go on to you next?
Sure. So I'm Mark Horowitz. I'm a training psychiatrist, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be on this panel with everyone else. I did a PhD in psychiatry. I was a fairly conventional psychiatrist, I would say. I did a PhD in the neurobiology of depression and the way that antidepressants affect the brain by looking at brain cells in a dish. I had no intention of going into withdrawal research until I had a very short, sharp, painful introduction to the topic of withdrawal by trying to come off escitalopram after being on it for many years, an antidepressant. And I quickly worked out by reading Giovanni's work that what had happened to me wasn't rare and it wasn't isolated. And also that the academics and psychiatrists that I'd studied under had very little to say that was useful about how to come off these drugs. And in fact, many of them tried to minimize the scale of the problem. And I ended up going on peer support websites to get advice on how to come off the drugs safely. And I learned a lot from people like Adele Framer, who ran Surviving Antidepressants. And since then, I've spent my time trying to write articles and explain to doctors and other people what is the safest way we think to come off psychiatric drugs, including antidepressants and antipsychotics and other drugs. I also have the privilege of working on the RADAR trial with Joanna, in which we're taking people off antipsychotics slowly, and we're also looking at ways of implementing safe tapering into the public health system in England and the NHS. Thank you.
Okay, so the other people that were on that panel there on the top left with the white hair is Giovanni. He's a professor, Giovanni Fava, who's from Italy but works in the United States. And on the other side, on the right, on the top, is a man called Peter Groot from Holland, who has devised tapering strips, which are people can take when they're withdrawing from psychiatric drugs. And the person top center, who's the host of the thing, is someone who came off psychiatric drugs himself. He was a civil servant for 20 years, had a bad effect, and we'll be talking about him later. And he has a podcast called Let's Talk Withdrawal, which is a pretty good resource to have, where he interviews all the people who are involved in this area. Okay. Now, potential effects of prescribed drugs on therapeutic work. You can see there, it lists some of those. It may limit emotional access to clients, so clients aren't aware of how they feel. So if we think of this in choice theory terms, we can think of it as having effects on all aspects of total behavior. So they won't be as aware of what's happening in the feeling component of total behavior. It may alter the way clients think, feel, and behave, the other aspects of total behavior. So you could have people with poor concentration, maybe confused, losing track of ideas, difficulties in structuring thought, problems staying focused, being uninvolved, emotionally withdrawn, suppressing anger, passivity in the session, probably not something we'd want, and outside the session. Imagine making plans with someone and they just don't care. Well, I didn't just get around to doing that this week, and next week is the same. No, I just didn't get around to it. Disengagement from work, not something you really want, or from social activities. And lastly, clients may have difficulty in describing their issues. Now, the last presentation you were at by Ken, the last story he told at the end about Sir Gawain, and I'm just thinking that story came from 600 years ago. And I'm just thinking if and he ended up with this dilemma at the end. And or a conflict. So if he had this conflict in 2021, what would he do? Well, most likely he would go to his GP and he would discuss it in the 7 minutes that the visit would last. And the chances are that when he was leaving, he would have a prescription. And the prescription would probably be for an antidepressant. He might get one for a benzodiazepine, but the doctor probably wouldn't do that because he would have learned that benzodiazepines do cause withdrawal, and he would believe that antidepressants don't cause withdrawal problems. So Sir Gawain would have his prescription, and we can just imagine how he would get on. But looking at that page there, if he decided that in addition to the drug, that maybe he would go along to a psychotherapist, a reality therapy psychotherapist. Well, looking at the bottom one there, he may have difficulty in describing his issue, which would be a problem for you. He may have difficulty in concentrating, and he may have difficulty in all the other areas that we see there. So the idea of taking the drug and going to counseling at the same time, there are dangers, and the benefits of the two approaches are unproven, is what Professor Moncrief would say. Okay. Sorry for the delay here. I have to move around my picture from one part of the screen to another. So now, some reflections for therapists. So the question is asked in the guidelines, what position do I take in relation to the medical model? Now, you know the medical model believes in chemical imbalances. We will probably come back to that at the end if we have time, but I'm going to skip through it fairly quickly for now, because I think you know the medical model suggests there's a chemical imbalance. In the case of depression, they're saying there's something wrong with serotonin. There isn't enough serotonin available. And that's what it says. It's interesting that just the last week in Britain, there was a program, a TV program in the morning, and a doctor came on and she made a lot of statements which have ruffled a lot of feathers in Britain. She said, for one thing, that she told people that, yes, there is a biochemical imbalance, and that the drug would cure the chemical, deal with the chemical imbalance. And she told them about effects. She said, the effects of the drugs would only kick in if you were depressed. If you were a non-depressed person who took the drugs, there wouldn't be any effects at all. So this was very misleading information. And a group of psychiatrists and psychologists have written a letter to the TV company asking that this information be corrected, or that they bring somebody else on who can give a different viewpoint. Because it doesn't tie in with the evidence at all. Okay. So the guidelines really bring into question this medical model. This is the medical model that Dr. Glasser would have always questioned. So it really, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what would he have to say if he was here and saw this happening. Okay. The second thing there is, how does my preferred theoretical model enable me to think about the role and function of prescribed drugs? Now, I think for a choice theory person, they'll be able to answer that fairly quickly. Should I consider signposting the client to further relevant information or evidence about their drugs? And I think that's, for me, was something new, the idea that that might be a role for therapists, that they could signpost or suggest to people or invite people to look at or alert people to the fact that there is information out there about the drugs, and would they like to look up some of this. So it's not making a decision for them, it's not giving them advice, which you cannot do, but it might be providing information. And I suppose that ties in very well with choice theory, because we said all we can do is provide information. Okay, this was from the British Medical Journal in 2019, and it talked about declining sex in Britain under the heading of antidepressants and sex. And of course, what they said in the end was that it might be the depression that's causing the lack of interest, whereas Dr. David Healy, whom you can see up there in the right-hand corner, said it's not the depression that's causing this lack of interest, it's the drugs that people are taking for the depression, depressing in our terms. Now, one of the key issues, I suppose, when people are withdrawing is that when they go to doctors, doctors frequently mistake withdrawal reactions for the return of the depression that was there in the beginning, relapse. And this is a very important piece in the guidelines. They want to try to distinguish between withdrawal and relapse. This was a letter sent to the Times in Britain by Wendy Byrne, who was the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 2008. And she was president when she wrote this. I've just taken out a couple of lines out of it. She said, in the vast majority, oh yes, this followed on from a survey that they had done just weeks before of a number of members of the public, in which they discovered that something like 60% had said they were having withdrawal effects after trying to stop taking their drugs. So a couple of weeks after that, she writes this to the paper. She said, in the vast majority of patients, any unpleasant symptoms experienced on discontinuing antidepressants have resolved within 2 weeks of stopping treatment. So it went contrary to their own survey, and this is outlined in Dr. Terry Lynch's book. And it led to formal complaints to the Royal College of Psychiatrists by groups of psychiatrists and interested psychologists, and a complaint to the General Medical Council. Now that's a big deal. When a doctor gets a formal complaint going into the General Medical Council, they have the power to bring people before them. They have the power to revoke their license even. So this was amazing stuff. And Dr. Terry Lynch writes about this at great length. Well, after his book was published, things changed a little bit. And only in the last week or two, I came across this letter also written by Wendy Byrne under 2 years later in September 2020 to the British Medical Journal. And she says, it became clear I had underestimated the number of people experiencing difficulties in stopping antidepressants, and that the problem was widely under-recognized across healthcare. She continues, the colleges, that's the Royal College of Psychiatry, the college's position in 2018 had not been right, Okay, so she was admitting that things were different. She said, I don't need to read the next bit. Ongoing monitoring is also needed to distinguish the features of antidepressant withdrawal from emerging symptoms which may indicate a relapse. Now, she continued in that letter to the British Medical Journal, and she said that she had gone and spoken to different groups. One of them is Drop the Disorder in the UK with Lucy Johnston, who has this alternative to the DSM. She spoke to one of the online websites. Mark Horowitz, in his little video section there, said that he couldn't get the help from doctors and that he went to an online website, and he mentioned a woman called Adele Framer. Apparently her website in the States gets 750,000 hits per month, or visits per month. So Wendy Byrne went and spoke to her about her experience and about the experiences of people who go into her website. So she changed her position, which was really interesting. And when I went into their own site last week, I found that they now have guidelines for people in the Royal College of Psychiatry website. They have very useful guidelines for people who want to withdraw, and we'll be getting sections of those guidelines later on. So that was interesting. And all of that, no doubt, came from the publication of these guidelines and the work done by the man Luke Montague and others. Among the things, he helped set up a Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry in the UK, which takes a critical look at what's happening. And he was helped with the publication of the guidelines, and he has been a speaker at BMA, British Medical Association conferences. And he is also on the board of an organization called NICE in Britain. NICE, and it sets the guidelines for what should happen. And they have the most recent guidelines that NICE have for depression were published in 2009, but they have managed to update them to reflect this idea that it takes longer to withdraw than 1 or 2 weeks, and that some people have a lot of difficulty. And they're putting in a bigger review, which is due to be published in May 2022. Okay. Now, models of support. Those are 2 books. That's the book by Dr. Peter Breggin. Some of you may know of Peter Breggin's name, I'd imagine. Psychiatric drug withdrawal, and it has a great lot of information, different scenarios, different case studies, different dilemmas that occur. And the second book I put there was a book that was actually just published yesterday, and I had a quick glance through it. It's by the man who was on the panel there on the top left, Giovanni Fava, and it's specifically about discontinuing antidepressant medications. Okay. Now, possible withdrawal reactions to the newer antidepressants. This is taken from Peter Breggin's book. So you can have all sorts of symptoms in withdrawal, ones that affect the sensory system, unusual ones like electric shock sensations. They're not ones that people who are depressed get, but people who are withdrawing do get them. Dizziness is a very common one. Flu-like symptoms. Movement disorders, you probably know of that term akathisia. Akathisia is restless legs type thing, where someone can't sit down still, they need to keep on the move all the time. I remember talking to somebody once in a practicum group about, and I mentioned the word akathisia, and the person said, I can tell you exactly what akathisia is. I had it once. And she said, I knew what it was. I was going to my doctor by taxi, and we got into a traffic jam. And she said, I was so restless, I couldn't sit there. And I got out of the taxi and ran to the doctor. So that was the best description I heard of that term. Sleep disturbances, people can't sleep, and gastrointestinal disturbances, all the stomach things, vomiting, diarrhea. The reason it affects that is that most of the body's serotonin, according to Dr. Healy, is found in the gut rather than in the brain. So it's affecting most systems. Now, how many people get withdrawal? So it's estimated in the British that about half the people who try to stop get some form of withdrawal reaction, and about half of that group get severe withdrawal. So about a quarter of people overall is estimated get severe withdrawal. So that means that people have to think longer term in terms of withdrawal, and it's not 1 or 2 weeks. And it depends on how long someone is on the drug. If you're on it a month, you might be able to withdraw in a couple of months. If someone is on the drugs for a number of years, it's going to be months or even years in order to withdraw. But within that, there's massive variability. So some people will have no withdrawal reactions. 50% maybe even wouldn't have any, but there's 50% who will. Okay. And I suppose another point that I'm seeing mentioned very often here is a point that Dr. Glasser said so often: so little is known about the brain. And I'm coming across that phrase all the time from the people I'm reading. They know some of the things that happen, but they all admit that really they only know a small amount of it. So what is withdrawal? So when someone takes a psychiatric drug, the body views it as foreign and tries to counteract its effect by adapting to it. Okay, so it goes in, the brain, it goes into a normal brain, and it creates abnormalities. It creates an imbalance. Peter Breggin had that in his book a long time ago, and Dr. Glasser always said the same thing. So it's the drug that creates the imbalance. It's not that the drug is given to correct an imbalance, it's that the drug creates an imbalance in an already balanced brain. Over time, higher doses might be needed to achieve the same tolerance, same effect, and that's called tolerance. And when the drug is stopped or reduced, the adaptations are no longer opposed by the drug's presence. So you get withdrawal reactions. This can lead to unpleasant sensations, which are called withdrawal, and withdrawal refers to the process and reactions to reducing or stopping. Okay. One of the things that the points that's made, we'll be coming to it later on, is how do you distinguish between withdrawal and relapse? And one of the ways is that withdrawal reactions occur within days usually, or very quickly, whereas relapse tend to occur after a number of weeks. Now, when can it happen? Right, when it can happen when someone stops a drug completely, that's cold turkey. Or when someone just misses a dose, and that's particularly for short-acting drugs with a short half-life. So some of the antidepressants, Prozac has a long half-life. It's a slow-acting drug, slow-releasing drug. Seroxat, on the other hand, is the one with the shortest half-life. So if you missed a dose of Seroxat, you would probably possibly go into withdrawal in between doses, even though you hadn't given it up. Between doses, when a tolerance, when changing drugs, this can happen. Or even it says when changing the brand of the same drug. Now, difference between withdrawal, relapse versus withdrawal. Terry Lynch there, that's Terry Lynch, and he said in his 2018 book, he said, relapse is a far more palatable conclusion for prescribing doctors to arrive at than having to contemplate the anxiety-provoking possibility that the substances they prescribe with such enthusiasm could be adding significantly to the person's problem by causing prescribed drug dependence. So doctors are much more comfortable at talking about relapse. They see it as relapse when it comes in. They don't want to see it as withdrawal. So distinguishing between the two, and this is taken from a presentation that was made last week to the British Psychological Society. And this is from a slide from Dr. Horowitz, Mark Horowitz, that you saw earlier. And he has it about distinguishing withdrawal symptoms from relapse. And I think this was a useful slide, I thought. So he said one of the clues to distinguishing one from the other is the quick onset, days, sometimes hours, compared with weeks or months for relapse. And he makes the exception then of Prozac being the long-acting drug, which stays in the body a long time. So that's more difficult to distinguish. In the case of Prozac, it's more difficult to distinguish one from the other. Distinctive, often different symptoms like dizziness and the electric shock and other symptoms that weren't present originally. And the patient might even say, this doesn't feel like my original complaint. So patients recognize there's something different. So these are all clues for distinguishing. And then there's often, he said, a quick resolution if the drug is reinstated, sometimes within hours or days, depending on how fast the drug acts. Pattern of symptoms, withdrawal symptoms, they tend to go in a wave. They worsen, reach a peak, and then resolve. He says that's the pattern with them. And as withdrawal symptoms can be severe and or long-lasting, these cannot always be usefully distinguished from relapse. So it's not that easy to do, but those are clues as to how someone might do it. So the next area that they go on to is helping people how to taper, how to reduce. And these guidelines, and including the stuff that I'm going to show you now, this particular slide, they were put up by Dr. Horowitz and a pharmacologist, Professor Taylor, and they're published now on the UK Royal College of Psychiatry website. So that's quite a move from denying it in 2018 to having this here in 2021. So this is one where he talks about how to, it deals with one problem that some people have, and that is that they find when they get lower and lower into the dose that their withdrawal reactions are worse. That the last bit, in other words, of withdrawal is the very worst, not the first bit. And he has this diagram down here to show it. He talks about the effect on the brain. So he says, for example, here, I'll just go through this slowly. If someone, this is for one particular drug, citalopram, an antidepressant, and he talks about if someone was on a dose of 20 per day, then it would have an effect on the brain of 80%. By 80%, he uses a term of receptor occupancy. So that's how he's measuring it. So 80% of the receptors would be occupied. Now, if someone dropped down to, what is this next one here? It's probably about 7 or so. It would have an effect of about 60% occupancy. But then if someone went from 7 to 0, it would drop suddenly from 60 to 0, effect on the brain. So what he says is people need to get the same drop in effect on the brain, this axis here, 60, 80, 60, 40, 20, down to 0. And to do that, they have to reduce the dose, not by going from 20 down to 10, down to 5, down to 2.5, down to 0, which is what doctors sometimes do. It's not that they have to do, they have to drop it by the amount which will give the same effect on the brain, basically. And you can see here, the purple arrow there, it was a considerable drop in dosage from 20 down to whatever it is, 15, maybe, and that gave that purple effect on the brain. But to get the same effect the next time, you have to have it smaller. That's the green arrow. And the next one, the yellow one, smaller again, and the green one is tiny. So that they were getting all the way down, in this case, to 0.8 milligrams before the person eventually stopped. So this is on the website. Now, as he says, therapists sort of need to have an idea about this. It's all medical knowledge and none of us would be able to work it out. I wouldn't be able to work it out, but we need to have an idea. He calls this a hyperbolic curve. And that's the way that drugs work. Their initial, when they're introduced in the first place, their initial effect is very fast. And then it begins very fast, goes up 20, 40, 60, 80, and then it begins to even off very much, almost plateau. He talks there about that curve, and when people are withdrawing, he talks about he uses a metaphor of someone who is above on the 10th story building of a high-rise building, and he says if you suddenly withdraw, it's like jumping from the 10th floor down to the ground floor. He says what needs to happen is people need to come down floor by step on each floor. And the working out of the steps is the key bit, and that's for the medical people. And that's what this curve is about, working out what the steps should be so that the effect on the brain is constant. So withdrawal then, he says, is the difference between what the brain expects and what the brain is receiving. And that's what he calls withdrawal. The difference between, and that sounds, I think, very familiar to us. So I was just trying to put that in choice in terms of our the chart. So if, for example, the brain had expected an occupancy level of 90% here in the quality world, and the occupancy in the perceived world, the brain perceives it only at 40%, then when that is sent up to the comparing place and the scales, the scales are going to be unbalanced, and there's going to be a frustration signal, and that's going to turn on the brain's behavioral system, which will have to come up with some behaviors. Now, presumably, if this is the first time it's happened, it will have to be a creative behavior. And no one is sure exactly, but they mentioned the words upregulation and downregulation, mean that receptors can either close down or you can open up more receptors. If there's too much serotonin, they can, more than the brain wants, they can close down some of the receptors, downregulation, or if the other way, they can open up more upregulation. Plus, he said, and Peter Breggin says the same, lots of other things happening in the brain that we don't know anything about. And they all come out as total behaviors, which presumably were the list of behaviors we saw in the previous slide there. Changes on feeling, changes on thinking, concentration, apathy in the case of maybe, or something like that. In the case of feeling, changes like poor concentration in the case of thinking, the physiological changes and the changes in doing. Okay, so that's my understanding of it if you were to try and translate it into our chart. Now, there are two further diagrams just showing what this might mean, and they're by Horowitz as well, and they're on that Royal College of Psychiatry website from this October 2020, just showing the various steps for the reduction of that drug. So if someone was to reduce by 50%, which is a very big reduction, every 2 to 4 weeks, it'd look something like this. 40 would go down to 20, then after 2 or 4 weeks it would go down to 10, then after another 2 to 4 weeks 5, etc., all the way until someone stopped. When they get down here, 2.5, 1.25, 0.6, very often there aren't tablets available in those sizes, and for people who are withdrawing, this poses a problem. So you can see here they're suggesting that someone switch to liquid forms of the drug at that stage. The other alternative is they switch to what Peter Groot has, which in Holland, which are these tapering strips, which are apparently done out just as in the drug sizes that people actually need. Okay, and he put one other one, which I think is an interesting one. This is for Seroxat, paroxetine it's called, and this one by a reduction by 10%. And this gives you an idea of how long it might take. 10% every 2 to 4 weeks. So 40 would be reduced by 10%, that's 4, so it should go down to 36, and it kind of 36 by 4, it go down by a further 3.6, and it goes down. So it goes down all along like that. And I just want to highlight the last one here. And you can see here all those steps, and then it says here, and 29 further steps using a combination of tablets and liquid. So until it eventually got down to 0.6 and then stop. So it's a lengthy process. I don't know what the length for that would be. but you could work it out. I think that's probably going to run. If each of those steps was a month, you can work out how long it's going to take. It's quite a long time. It's 29 plus it's what, well over 30, nearly 40 steps. It could be anything from 20 months to 40 months to do that. So this is a long drawn out process. So they were just examples that were put there. The point being made in the guidelines is everyone is different. And the general idea that's given is that someone should withdraw at their own pace, and they should see what's comfortable. Withdraw by a certain amount, wait until the withdrawal effects, if there are withdrawal effects, wait till they wear off, then repeat it, wait till they wear off and repeat again, and keep going like that. And then there might be people who have to reinstate it if the withdrawal effects are too great. They may have to reinstate a previous dose. Right, now what we need to get to, obviously, is the role of psychotherapists, which is what we're here to look at today. So, role of therapists. It says therapists, Peter Breggin says, therapists can no longer assume that a prescription once written should be continuously taken by the patient, and that their professional role is limited to encouraging or monitoring compliance. So there's a move away from seeing the therapist as someone who just says, this is doctor's business, and if I have any role, it's just to make sure that you comply with whatever the doctor suggests. One of the points they made is maybe a 15-minute or a 7-minute meeting with the prescriber isn't going to be sufficient on its own for someone who's withdrawing from drugs, and there's a need for a collaborative approach. That's the theory between the therapist and everyone involved. Therapist, the person who's getting off the drugs, in some cases maybe the family, in other cases maybe the doctor or prescriber. It's a challenging idea. There's no doubt about that. Right. Now, relevance for therapists. Last week's presentation, it was said that GPs and psychiatrists are still poorly trained in identifying withdrawal symptoms and distinguishing them from relapse. So there's an education thing there, which will take quite a while. They are also poorly trained in safe tapering, and it may take them years to be upskilled. So that's an interesting thing. It's saying that the person they're going to as prescriber may not be up to speed on all of these things. As a result, many patients with withdrawal are still misdiagnosed as relapsing. Doctors still reduce patients' medication over 4 to 8 weeks and conclude patients cannot come off them because of feeling worse. And therapists may be in an ideal position, he said, to spot withdrawal symptoms, to advocate for patients, and to support patients through withdrawal. So these are fairly giving a new role, if you like, to therapists, psychological therapists. The guidelines looked at some ethical principles, and they said there's nothing in the codes of ethics in the UK anyway, or probably at the States either, and I'm not sure about Slovenia or Croatia, nothing that addresses specifically withdrawal, but there are general ethical principles that can be applied. And that's, they actually, when they were writing their document, they consulted with an ethics professor, Tim Bond. So it's a very well thought out document, and definitely one, if you're interested in this area, definitely one I would encourage you to get and to read. Act in the client's best interests. So there's one that can justify doing this. Treat patients with respect. Do not harm. Don't do harm or collude in the harming of your client. And the importance of the client's autonomy, that they make the decision in the end, not the counsellor and not the doctor either. So you're supporting them in making the decision. And I just had a quick glance at yesterday's book by Giovanni Fava, and he refers to shared decision making, which he said really is the model for all of medicine. But he said it probably isn't happening all that much. But this should be the model, he reckons, where there's a shared decision making between the patient and the doctor when these things are being discussed, be it withdrawal or going on a drug. The other issue, I think, ethical principle is this one of informed consent. And Professor Joanna Moncrief reckoned that informed consent when a patient goes to a doctor should be meaning that informing people that the drugs will change the normal state of the brain. Now, that would be quite a move for a doctor to say that. And there is not enough research to tell us how they will do this and the long-term implications of taking them, admitting that these things are not known. And thirdly, a need to weigh the pros and cons of taking a drug for each particular person, Dr. Healy says randomized controlled trials tell us about the average patient. They don't tell us about the one particular patient, and that may be quite different from the average. Okay. John Reid in the UK said that in his estimation, only about 1% of people prescribed antidepressants are told about withdrawal when they are first prescribed in that visit to the doctor. 1%. So this just isn't happening at the moment. No. The guidelines make a distinction between medical advice and medical information. And they make it very clear that psychological therapists are absolutely not in a position or allowed ethically to give medical advice, but they are allowed to give medical information. And the distinction between them they make is sharing information from a reputable source. So, for example, it could be that guideline on the Royal College of Psychiatrists. That could be shared. Or clients could be told about that if they were interested. Discussing scientific evidence or offering a different perspective. Those things would be okay. What wouldn't be okay, medical advice, offering a diagnosis, obviously. You can't prescribe drugs. Although I suppose it's interesting that some psychologists are looking for the right to prescribe drugs. Advising on dosage and frequency, we can't do that. And we cannot give personal advice on how to withdraw. Give general information or point people towards general information, but not personal advice to one particular person. Okay. Now, clients considering prescription. So maybe what might be useful to do there, evidence for the main effects of the drug, evidence for the risks of drug dependence, evidence for the likely impact of the drug on therapy, or has the prescriber discussed possible effects, asking the client, has your doctor discussed possible effects or potential for dependence? Would you maybe like to go back and ask that? That would be a brave question to ask. Now, working with clients' beliefs held about prescribed psychiatric drugs. So exploring these. So exploring beliefs like problem, is there a belief by the client that the problem is caused by a chemical imbalance or by genetics? Could that be discussed at a session? The idea that drugs are going to quickly and effortlessly get rid of feelings of sadness. And there's a problem, this applies in some countries, but not all. Sometimes clients are only eligible for financial benefits if they're on drugs. That's a really tricky one. And if they don't have a diagnosis and a prescription, they don't get the drug. And that's a tricky one to discuss. But an important one. That probably varies from country to country, I think. Now, the role of therapists during withdrawal. Addressing fears about the withdrawal process and identifying ways the attempt might be inadvertently sabotaged by the client. potential support networks. So it's important that people have support out there. They need a supportive doctor. They need a support of friends who'll see them through at difficult times. Discussing availability of extra sessions. So someone might decide they want to have extra sessions during this process of withdrawal to help them. And it might be, it might also be discussed what would happen at the session. For example, if someone is in the midst of withdrawal and having a difficult time, it's probably not the correct time to go into difficult material with the client, but it might be a more supportive type thing. Now that probably applies to models other than our own, more so ones where they'll be bringing up past issues and things like that. That wouldn't be the time to do that. Choice theory is probably in a better position to offer the relevant support, I think, to someone who's withdrawing. Now, some other things: helping clients to identify withdrawal reactions. Okay. Encouraging the client to move at the pace that's right for them. Suspending the deeper psychological work, we said that. Help clients identify coping strategies for dealing with their problems of withdrawal, and maintaining the warm therapeutic relationship. You can expect that. Facilitate communication with the family, the individual, and prescriber, etc. Okay. Now, it is even suggested there that if the therapist had any concerns regarding what the prescriber, how they might be understanding withdrawal or what they might be advising, that they might talk to the client about that and encourage the client to go back with some new information, maybe to the prescriber, or that they might even, with the client's permission, communicate directly with the prescriber. You can see it's a sensitive area. And I suppose there's a role for the counsellor there in helping people to plan things in a sensitive way. So, for example, if someone is wanting to withdraw from the psychiatric drug, we'll say, how they approach their doctor might be important. They might need to provide them with some recent information. And say, you know, sometimes they say, well, there's new stuff, there's a new guidelines that came out just very recently. You may not have had a chance to see those. I just brought them along. Or when someone is withdrawing, instead of saying, I want to stop my psychiatric drug, if someone says something like, would it be possible for us to look at the possibility of a reduction? Now, that's a lot more acceptable to a doctor than the word stop. Now, the role of the therapist, what is helpful? So, right, accurate information. We've looked at that. I'm going to just move on from that now in a moment. I will, by the way, send those slides. I'll send a copy of the slides afterwards. I've sent them already, but I might just send a renewed copy that can be circulated, hopefully. So I'm just going to move to this one in practice. Now, they bring up a couple of scenarios here, which I think might be just of interest. And it says, yeah, in practice, I'll go to the next one. I'm just keeping an eye on time. Now, withdrawal in the midst of normal therapeutic work. So a client might say, for example, my boyfriend says I must really need the pills. He can tell if I've forgotten to take them. So the therapist, what does the therapist say in a case like that? So the guideline suggests what is it he notices and explores. And explore that particular issue. What exactly does he notice? And it then goes on a little bit further, and it says, so you have the first two lines there, and says, I wonder if you'd consider the possibility that what you're experiencing is the effect of not taking the medication, a mini withdrawal rather than an underlying problem showing through. The effects of missing a dose or stopping taking these drugs is only now being more commonly recognized. Even the Royal College only commonly recognized it there in the last year or two. So I think it's sort of helpful the way it sensitively addresses issues like this. The general guideline they have is that unless proven otherwise, things that happen when someone is withdrawal should be seen as withdrawal problems unless proven otherwise, unless proven to be relapse. So the starting position is that it's withdrawal. And a second one here, the client says, I'm feeling so much better. I've decided to stop taking my medication. Therapist, after normal exploration, says, what's your plan for coming off? Sometimes people aren't aware that it needs to be done very slowly to avoid experiencing withdrawal reactions. Have you had a chance to discuss it with your prescriber? The client says, yes, they've suggested I take one every other day. Now, we saw that taking one every other day is not an ideal situation. It can certainly lead to withdrawal. So the therapist might say, as you know, I'm not a medic and so can't give you medical advice, but I can highlight relevant information. There is evidence that doing this can lead to triggering withdrawal reactions, and that a slow, smooth reduction can be more successful. I can let you have some links to some information if you'd like to look into that. And then they say, for example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists has issued a new leaflet about coming off antidepressants, which covers this. How might it feel to go back to your prescriber to discuss it again? So maybe go back armed with that little page. So that's a really good one. And so it's coming from a source that doctors would recognize and be value. Okay, so that's some of the things that are there in terms of the role of the psychotherapist. Now, just moving on some other, Right, we talked a little bit there earlier on about what about some of the research, combined psychotherapy and drugs, which is recommended in, we'll say, the NICE guidelines. The guidance says on that, it says current evidence does not support the idea that antidepressants improve or correct a specific biological component to depression, a disease-centered model, which could act in parallel with psychotherapy. And there's two other quotes there that you can read maybe when I send you the slides. Well, maybe I'll read the second one. From what we know of the alternatives, alterations antidepressants produce, it's not clear that they would aid psychotherapy, and they may even be counterproductive. So you don't want someone who can't take action, who is less aware of their issues, etc., etc. Okay. Some other issues that are dealt with in the guidance. I suppose more complicated situations are where someone is on more than one drug, what's called polypharmacy. And in 2009, which is quite a long time ago, 1/3 of psychiatric outpatients were on 3+ psychiatric drugs. So I think that's a very common situation. And a common combination then is antidepressants and benzodiazepines. So antidepressants have a stimulating effect, and they often give benzodiazepines then to calm people down. And there's very little research on effects, duration, and severity of withdrawal. I think someone at one of the presentations I was at mentioned that there were only something, when they looked at it, there was only something like 15 studies on withdrawal, whereas on starting antidepressants, there was countless studies, hundreds or thousands. So I suppose, antidepressants, they're actually given for so many different things, that like they can be given for anxiety, they can be given for depression, they can be given to someone who can't sleep, fatigue, they can be given to someone to stop smoking. So they're given for a lot of different things. It's really interesting that we mentioned adverse effects recently, and the adverse effects work on anyone who takes them. So-called in research normal volunteers. So someone who was never depressed and is given an antidepressant, the effects of the drugs will be exactly the same. And if someone is going to feel suicidal or anything else, it can have the effect on the normal average person, just the same as on someone who's depressed. So I'll be coming to that in a moment. How effective are they? Well, one piece of interesting stuff there is how do psychiatric drugs work? And there's a model there from Joanna Moncrieff, and she talks about the naming of psychiatric drugs. And she said in the 50s, sedatives were used mainly to control people who were out of control, and they were seen as nothing but that. But from the 1960s onwards, she said, that drugs are seen to reverse a psychiatric disease, one which Dr. Glasser didn't believe existed, and they begin to get names like antipsychotics, antidepressants, or mood stabilizers. In other words, suggesting that they have an action on that. It's interesting, even the wording of drugs. Prozac, when it came out first, they got a branding company to come up with the name. Before that, drugs had a name that said something about the nature of the drug or the type of drug it was. But Prozac, it came from pro, pro meaning professional, and Zac, which they thought suggested that it came in and targeted the disease in some way, zacked it. So Prozac. And David Healy said, for the first time, you had patients going into doctors, not just saying, give me something for the way I feel, not even saying, give me an antidepressant for the way I feel, but they were going in saying, give me Prozac. So great news for the company that made it, Eli Lilly. Joanna Moncrieff has two models. She calls one the disease-centered model. That's the one where people accept that there's a chemical imbalance, claim there's a chemical imbalance, and claim that the drug is going to do something to change or normalize the chemical imbalance. So that goes right back to the chemical imbalance theories that were out there. And she said they started off with the idea that the psychiatric drugs that they acted on the neurotransmitter systems, and then that people felt better afterwards. And when people felt better, they said it must have done something to change it must have been a problem in the neurotransmitter to begin with. So she said that's something like saying if alcohol is given for anxiety, she says no, and it suggests that anxiety is caused by a deficiency of alcohol. It's not correcting a chemical imbalance like that. It causes one, but it doesn't correct one. Thomas Insel, he was the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health in the States. He said after 20 billion spent on research, there have been no tangible benefits produced. Okay, so that's the chemical imbalance. What she calls disease-centered model. That's the one centered on chemical imbalance. You're depressed, it's caused by a chemical imbalance. You will need antidepressants for life, like insulin for diabetes. One of the people you saw on the panel there, that's exactly what he was told by his doctor. And then when he wanted to get off the drugs eventually, he was told, take half for a week and then give them up. And that obviously didn't work and left him in a pretty bad state. So very difficult to do that. Okay. Now that's an ad from when drugs were being promoted in the beginning, disease center, teen depression. The drugs were being targeted to those things. That's from Newsweek in, I think, sometime in 1990 or something like that. There were campaigns everywhere. In Britain, there was a campaign, defeat depression, and there were elsewhere as well. There's also one, GlaxoSmithKline, they got a license to market Seroxat called Paxil in the States for social phobia. And they were able, in the States, you can market it direct to consumer advertising, and the marketing company put it down as something for shyness. So that left a fairly big market there. Although you wouldn't think there'd be a big market for shyness, maybe in the United States, and they're not known for their shyness. That another interesting thing was it was approved for social phobia, but the idea someone said with social phobia was that that maybe should belong to psychologists dealing with it, maybe behavior therapists. So that wasn't good. So the term was changed then to social anxiety disorder, and that was the DSM who did that. So working, if you, in a sense, to promote the drug for more uses. Okay. Now, I just managed to get a few more in here. Now, so it says psychiatry adopted the disease center model because it bolstered the idea that psychiatric disorders are the same as other medical disorders. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, you know that, SSRIs. What does the word selective suggest to you? Just think about that for a moment. Because for most people, I think we think that selective means the drug is going to go in and be very selective. It'll affect the serotonin system and nothing else. But David Healy says for a pharmacologist, this means something very different. It means it can act on every brain system except one, called the norepinephrine system. So it's misleading marketing terms. So the actual term is very misleading, SSRI, selective serotonin. That's not nearly as selective as what it suggests. Now, Joanna Moncrief's alternative to that, which you're wondering about, I'm sure, is she calls it the drug center model. And she says these are psychoactive drugs, that they have effects on the brain, effects on everyone who takes them, producing an altered physical and mental states, and and changes the way people act, think, and feel. And she says taking the drug creates an abnormal biological state, and the drug reacts to its presence in various ways. So she sees it no different from recreational drugs, if you like. And there were always drugs like this around. If you went into the 19th century, there's two drugs. The laudanum was, I think, opium, given to kids if they were crying or hungry or anything else like that. And there was also a very interesting one there, Vin Mariani, and that, it says, was His Holiness Pope Leo XIII awards the gold medal in recognition of benefits received from Vin Mariani. Vin Mariani turned out to be cocaine. Cocoa leaves in Bordeaux red wine, and the cocoa turned into cocaine when it was in the wine, apparently. And it was, apparently this company had about 1,000 famous people, including queens, presidents, and a pope, all putting their names down as having got benefits from this drug. So there were always psychoactive substances around. How do they work according to, how do drugs work according to Peter Breggin? They disable the brain. They cause medication spellbinding. Now, by that he means that it's like the effect of alcohol on a driver, a car driver. They think they can do something. They're unable to make an evaluation on their own, self-evaluation on their own performance. So it wouldn't be good for self-evaluation. So drugs wouldn't be good for self-evaluation if you were asking a client. And third, so they think they're medication spellbinding. People think they're doing better than they actually are. And they have chronic brain effects. Now, criticism of the medical model, you sort of probably know. The usual criticisms you would have heard in Dr. Glasser's, that there are no biomarkers, no blood tests, no scans, no x-rays. Long-term effects associated with poor outcomes and increased harms. Antidepressants, no significant benefits over placebo for most people. That's really interesting. And a questioning of the value of diagnosis. Now, I'll maybe show one or two slides here. I think this is maybe an interesting one, and it's in the guidelines. Combined data from all available trials, both published and unpublished, reveals that antidepressants have larger effects than placebo. But the difference is vanishingly small. That's in the guidelines. And the main rating in trials for the effects of drugs is the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, which has 54 points. And it seems most of them in trials have something like 2 points of a difference. Now, it says there's another scale that they have called the Clinical Global Impressions, which shows general improvement. And it says you'd need a minimum of 3 points to show any significant change on this clinical global impressions. And for minimum stuff, and you probably need 8+ points. So the drugs are having very little effect. So that's maybe an interesting thing, and it's there in the guidelines. Now, some of you might be dog owners, and perhaps if you have a dog at home, it might be good for you to know. I got this from the Veterinary Journal in Ireland there about 2 weeks ago. And it says it's the first licensed fluoxetine. Fluoxetine is Prozac for dogs. And it's targeting anxiety. And it's an interesting one because you can see the marketing there. It says up here, it says, separation happens, anxiety doesn't have to. So your dog can have Prozac too, but maybe you should have a chat with your dog before he decides to go on it. Now I'm going to 1 or 2 more points because we're coming to the last 3 or 4 minutes. There's a little bit here about drug trials and what do 2 positive results mean. In order to get a drug approved by the FDA in America, you need to have 2 positive trials. This is a quote from one of the senior FDA officials, a man called Paul Lieber. And he said, how do we interpret 2 positive results in the context of several more studies that fail to demonstrate that effect? He said, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. That would mean, in a sense, that the sponsor could just do studies until the cows come home, until he gets 2 of them that are statistically significant by chance alone. Okay. And I suppose one of my last here, the chance distorting the findings of drug trials. Drug trials, successful ones are much more likely to be published. Unsuccessful ones are a lot less likely to be published. And I have on a previous time talked about study 329, which was Seroxat for adolescent children, adolescents. And that is, and this will be my last slide, that was published with 22 big name authors. And it promoted the drug. It said it was effective and safe. Now, there were claims taken against that company afterwards and in court in which they were fined $2.5 million. And one of the things they had, and then there was a further one later where they were fined $3 billion. But one of the things they had to do was they had to make their study. David Healy was an expert witness at it. And one of the things they had to do was they had to make their study available online, the raw data, 77,000 pages of raw data available for other people other experts, researchers to look at. And they did do that, and the results were published. So there's 2 publications for this study 329, one by the company, and 10 years later, one by another group of researchers. And they are quite different. What they discovered was that, which happens all the time, is, of course, the 22 people had not seen the raw data. What the study was, is it was entirely ghostwritten. In other words, it was written by the company, and it was written by a woman called Sally Layden, and it proved not to be effective. They had used terms in it like emotional lability, which was a term not picked up by the experts, but picked up by a journalist. What did it mean? It meant someone was suicidal. So that was an interesting thing. So I'm finishing at that. I recommend you to look at some of the resources there. There are videos on the websites. I will send those about the guidelines, and you can get an actual copy of the guidelines. So it's been a privilege talking to you. I couldn't see you, but I'll just say goodbye to all 242 of you. All right. Thank you.